Good evening. I'm delighted to have you join me for our Bible study tonight. Tonight I'm going to be looking at the parable of the talents. This is a familiar parable that Jesus told, and I really think it's one that's very timely right now for everything that's going on in our country. This is a parable that is one of the more well known that Jesus did, but it has to do with the nature of God and what God expects of us and how to use what God has given to us and how we treat each other. And I think that is just a very timely Bible study for the times in which we find ourselves. I'll be working from this book, which is Stories Jesus Still Tells from Dr. Claypool, and it is so reflective of that fact that these are ongoing truths that we can relate to our lives now. It reads this way: For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them, and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled the accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents. The master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been you have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was mine with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Well, this word talent is interpreted differently in our time than it was in the people who first heard it. It was originally a unit of measurement, like a gram or something like that. But of course, one of the things I love about parables is they evolve over time. They still speak to us all these centuries later, and this word talent has come to mean a capacity or ability that a human being has received from God. It's important that we as Christians see our talents that way, that they are from God. That should cause us to take it more seriously, what we do with it. He says the people to whom Jesus first spoke these words were very familiar with the practice of this sort, of this, the master giving of what he has and having to go off, because think about it, the merchants of that time couldn't go to Walmart, so they had to go on long journeys to get their goods. Sometimes people in that area would travel as far as India or even Southern Europe to get what they needed. But what would you do in their case? If you were going on a long journey, you would, if you had lots of things, then you would put people in charge of things before you left. So before departing on a journey, the merchants and rulers turned over their property to trusted slaves, because travel was so uncertain back then. There was no way of knowing how long they'd be gone, or sometimes they wouldn't even come back at all because something would happen. So not only is such an image reflective of the way things were done in that era, but it also describes accurately the way the Hebrews understood the way that God related to people. Think about the stories that Hebrews were familiar with, like the creation story. It's this original act of divine generosity, and God enables creatures in his own image to experience the kind of joy that was unique to him. So this meant that such beings would, if they were going to be able to have his kind of joy, they were going to have some things. For instance, they were going to have to be able to do things, to have some kind of level of freedom, and they would need the quality of spirit that God possesses that finds delight in those things that both please the actor and bless all those who are affected by the actions. He says God's particular kind of joy is made up of three components, and they determine the specific way God relates to human beings. So God shows his love for as much in what he does not do for us as what he does for us, meaning that he gives us the freedom. He quotes Simone Weil that creation was the moment when God ceased to be everything so we human beings could become something. In other words, for human beings to develop fully, God must back away from us and allow us to do things on our own. He ironically uses this term, God's self-distancing from us is not a sign of desertion or abandonment, but precisely an expression of love that wills us to grow. This is how the Hebrews understood the dynamics of creation, and it corresponds beautifully with Jesus' analogy of a rich man handing over certain powers and freedoms and then going away for a time. This is the framework Jesus sets forth in the parable to describe God's relation to us and our relationship to God. Note that none of these individuals possessed anything on their own. What they had was bequeathed to them by the master. By the same token, each one of them was given the same mandate. They were to imitate what they had seen their master doing while he was with them. So they were expected to do exactly what he had taught them to do. You go out and trade and make more. And so he says we were all given the same mandate as well, to do with our gifts and powers what God does with his. And the note of accountability also applies to each one of us. God is not an irresponsible or an indifferent giver. God is going to want to know at the end of our journey what we have done with what we were given in the beginning through the abundance of divine generosity. It is in these ways that all of us human beings are just alike. While we are alike in our relationship and dependency on God, we are very different in terms of our natural capacities and backgrounds and the opportunities that are open to us. And boy, isn't that a telling point in what's going on today, that there are so many of us that just aren't given the kind of fair shot that they need in our society. Humankind has not been created equal in this regard. Think about this. The very first story of the first family is that Cain and Abel they did not have equal talents. And so this created a problem between them that ended up in death. That's the first story of the first family. It's a lesson that we all need to learn very early in life. He says the one who had received 5 talents went out at once and put those resources to work, just as his mentor had always done. Before long, he had returned the 5 talents into 10. The one who had received the 2 talents did exactly the same, but the slave who received only the 1 talent responded in a very different fashion. He dug a hole in the ground and buried his master's money. After a period of time, the landowner returned to settle the accounts. When the 5-talent man went forward, bringing 5 talents more, the landowner exclaimed, "Well done, good and trustworthy slave." He says, I hear an echo from the first chapter of Genesis here, where God looked on what he had done and exclaimed, "It's good. It's very, very good." The master continued, "You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." The man who had been given the 2 talents went forward, showing the same results, and he was given an identical affirmation and invitation to move deeper into the joy of his master. When the last slave responded, however, his was a very different story. "Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, have what is yours." And here we get a very different response from the master. "You wicked and lazy slave." He asked a question. "You knew that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter, did you? Then you ought to have taken my talent and taken it to the banker, so I would get in return what I had with interest. So then he says, so take the talent from him and give it to the man with the 10 talents. For to all who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. He continued, and here he's paraphrasing a little bit, remove this worthless slave from me. He is totally out of sync with the dynamics of the universe. Well, what do we make of these images? I think they confirm the fact that we are made in the image of a dynamic and creative God, and that we do taste God's kind of joy, God's kind of ecstasy when we imitate with our powers what we see God doing with his. The two slaves who were energetic and creative with their gifts modeled what God had in mind for creation from the very first. This universe about us is full of mystery, but I think you can count on the fact that it is finally a fair and faithful place when you follow the example that God described so beautifully in Genesis. He says this pattern does not mean we'll always, at every moment, get exactly what we think we want. There are many mysterious zigzags in the course of history, but at the bottom, there's also a fairness between what we sow and what we reap. In Jesus' parable, the owner was not interested in the quantity of what each was given, as in their faithfulness to be creative and fruitful with their opportunities. It follows that God is not going to ask for the same results from each one of us because we've not been all given the same abilities or opportunities. We don't all live in the same place. We're not treated the same way, but we're still expected to do something with what we have. He says, what will be asked of us is, what have you done with what you were given? Not what you were not given, not to make something out of nothing, but to use what you had. There's a wonderful old parable that describes when one comes before the judgment seat of God, God will not ask, why weren't you Abraham? Why weren't you Moses? What God will want to know is, were you yourself? Did you do the best that you could with what you have? The whole purpose of existence is for us to experience God's kind of joy. And the secret here is to use our power and freedom in the same way that God does, to delight himself and to bless others. Now, it's important that we look at what he describes as the shadow side of this parable. The third slave, who was given only 1 talent and did not do anything with it. There's a warning here, and it's a somber one. There are 2 ways of being unfaithful. The hot way, which is to abuse our powers and use them destructively. This is the sin of commission. Our old Baptists will expect the words that are going to come after this. Then there's the cold way of being unfaithful, which is to do nothing at all and therefore neglect and abort one's potential. That's the sin of omission. If you look carefully at the teachings of Jesus, he took the sin of underutilizing what you could be just as serious as the sin of overutilizing what you've been given and somehow abusing people. Sin is finally a matter of trying to be either more or less than we ought to be. Either way, we fall short of the glory of God. So let's look more closely at what has caused this tragic missing of the mark. What went wrong here? Why was the divine pattern of things disrupted? The most obvious explanation is simple. The slave didn't want to put forth the effort. He was lazy. Burying his talent in the ground was the lazy way of handling his responsibility. A second possibility for his failure, however, may have been jealousy and envy. The slave with the 1 talent may have noticed what was given to the others, and he may have focused more of his energy on what they had been given than on what he was given. Perhaps the third slave lost sight of his responsibility when his focus was deflected by noticing what the others had been given. A third possibility may have been that the smallness of his talent led him to conclude that what he had just didn't matter. He says, if I believe anything at all is this, in God's universe there is nothing that is insignificant. The great things were first of all little things that were lifted up to God in reverence and gratitude and then used to the fullest. It is a mistake to confuse size with value. Think about this. If we honestly believe that the things that are given to us are God given, then they cannot be viewed as small. Anything that is God given is something that can be used. He talks about a friend of his who wrote about his son being in a school play, and his little boy didn't get the part that he wanted, but he did get a part. It was just a couple lines toward the end of the play, and he said when the time come, he delivered his lines on time. He did it well, and he did what was expected of him. And then he writes about how this is the same kind of expectation he needs to have for himself as well. He says, I'm just a bit player too, not a star in any sense of the word, but God gave me a line or so in the pageant of life. And when the curtain falls and the drama ends and the stage is vacant at last, I do not ask for the critics' rave or fame in any amount. My only hope is this, that I can hear from afar the voice of God saying, He said His lines, and He said them well, not too soon, not too late, not too loud, not too soft. He said His lines, and He said them well. Well, the real problem that Jesus is pointing to with this slave who made this horrible mistake, the real problem was it was the issue of mistrust. He did not trust God. He says, the greatest of all dehumanizers, the reality of fear. Nothing distorts our humanity quite as much as the sense that there is not enough and therefore one has to fight or flee. He projected onto God what this slave projected onto his master, that God was hard, cruel, dishonest, and trustworthy. It was to undo this misrepresentation that Jesus entered into history. He quotes one of my very favorite preachers, John Killinger, and he says, Killinger believes that the reconciliation finally occurs when we let Jesus show us the Father and disprove forever the serpent's distortion of him. What this slave did out of fear is an analogy for what we humans do when we picture God fearfully instead of lovingly. We not only violate our own natures by becoming either more or less than we are, but we also unmake the whole creation of God that has been so carefully crafted. He says this is why Jesus takes the actions of this fearful slave so seriously. The fate of being cast into utter darkness is not meant to describe what God wants at all, but rather how important it is that we see God's true nature and then begin to live our lives accordingly. Remember, the Bible tells us that it is not the will of the Father that any one of these ones should be lost. So to warn against such a fate and to show us the way of salvation is why this parable was told. He ends by saying, remember, it's not too late for anyone. We can all see what Jesus came in the world to show, the nurturing nature of God, so much like that of a firm but compassionate parent. Then we begin to act out of love and not fear. Is this not the lesson that this country needs to hear during this time? It may have been, this story may be more needed now more than ever. That if we honestly believe that what we are given is from God, then we can learn to act out of love and not fear. Thank you for being with me.